Texas, summer of 1944. The hospital ward smelled of disinfectant and something darker underneath, something the nurses couldn't scrub away. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell lifted the blanket to check the patient's wounds and felt her hands begin to shake. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell lifted the blanket to check the patient's wounds and felt her hands begin to shake. She had been a prisoner of the German regime, transported across an ocean to die in American care. Sarah had treated soldiers torn apart by shrapnel. This was different. This broke something inside her she couldn't name. A telegram reached Fort Sam Houston on a morning when the heat already shimmered off the parade ground like water. June 1944. Europe was burning. The invasion beaches still red with American blood. And now this, 64 German prisoners of war, all women, arriving by hospital train from the East Coast. Medical emergency. Critical condition. Prepare for immediate treatment. Major Elizabeth Carter read the orders twice, her coffee going cold in her hand. She had served in North Africa, patched up boys who'd lost legs at Kasserine Pass, held hands as morphine took men away from pain they'd never escape. But German prisoners. Women. The telegram offered no details, just coordinates and a timeline. They would arrive in 72 hours. The hospital staff gathered in the main ward that afternoon. Sunlight cut through the windows in dusty beams, illuminating faces that had seen too much already. Sarah Mitchell stood near the back. 24 years old, steady hands, a reputation for never flinching. Next to her, Lieutenant Clara Hoffmann, whose grandparents had come from Bavaria, who spoke German in her sleep sometimes, whose brother had been killed over Bremen 3 months earlier. Major Carter's voice carried across the room, measured and calm. They would treat these prisoners as they treated any wounded, professional, humane. The Geneva Convention was not optional. Some of the nurses shifted uncomfortably. One of the orderlies, a farm boy from Kansas, stared at the floor with his jaw clenched tight. That evening, Sarah sat in the nurses' barracks writing to her mother in Vermont. The letter started 3 times, scratched out, begun again. She couldn't find words for what she felt. Anger, maybe. Confusion. Her fiancé Tommy was somewhere in France with the 101st Airborne. These women wore the same uniform as the soldiers who were trying to kill him. But they were also patients, also dying. She sealed the letter without mentioning the Germans at all. The preparations took 2 days. An entire wing of the hospital was cleared and scrubbed. Extra beds were brought in, medical supplies inventoried, plasma and whole blood requisitioned from San Antonio. The Army didn't explain where these prisoners had come from or why they were in such terrible condition. The nurses asked questions that went unanswered. They made the beds with crisp hospital corners and waited. The train arrived at 0600 hours on a Tuesday morning. The platform was empty, except for military police and medical personnel. The civilian trains held back on orders no one questioned. Sarah stood with the receiving team, her medical bag over her shoulder, her breath shallow in her chest despite the humid air. The doors of the hospital car opened, and the smell hit them first. Unwashed bodies, infection, the sweet rotten odor of tissue dying from the inside. Then the stretchers began to emerge, carried by medical orderlies whose faces went pale as they descended the steps. Women, skeletal, some unconscious, some staring with eyes that held nothing but distance. Sarah moved forward with the others, falling into the rhythm of triage, training overriding the shock that wanted to freeze her in place. She knelt beside the first stretcher and felt for a pulse. Thread-thin, erratic. The woman's face was gaunt, her lips cracked and bleeding, her hair patchy where malnutrition had caused it to fall out. Sarah called for plasma, for warm blankets, her voice steady even as her hands wanted to tremble. Clara Hoffmann stood frozen near the platform edge, staring at a woman who couldn't have been more than 19. The girl was conscious, her eyes moving slowly across the American uniforms, the clean platform, the Texas sky so impossibly blue above them. Clara started to say something in German, a greeting, a reassurance, but the words caught in her throat. Her brother's last letter was still in her footlocker, unread after the first time, too painful to revisit. By noon, all 64 prisoners had been transferred to the hospital ward. The medical staff worked in silence, moving from bed to bed with stethoscopes and blood pressure cuffs, recording vitals that painted a picture of systematic starvation and neglect. Weights ranged from 59 to 82 pounds. All showed signs of severe malnutrition, dehydration, untreated infections. 3 had tuberculosis. 7 had pneumonia. 1 was pregnant, her belly distended against ribs that showed through her skin like the bars of a cage. Major Carter conducted her rounds at 1400 hours, stopping at each bed, making notes on a clipboard that grew heavier with each entry. At the 16th bed, she paused. The woman lying there was perhaps 35, her face sunken but her eyes alert, watching everything with an intelligence that hadn't been dimmed by suffering. Carter checked the chart. Greta Schumann, 46 pounds. The same weight as Carter's 7-year-old nephew. That night, the nurses gathered in the barracks common room, unable to sleep, unwilling to be alone with what they'd seen. Sarah sat by the window, smoking a cigarette she'd bummed from one of the orderlies, even though she'd quit 6 months earlier. No one spoke for a long time. Outside, the Texas stars burned with an indifference that felt almost cruel. Clara broke the silence finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She had asked one of the prisoners, in German, where they had come from. The woman had looked at her with something like pity and said simply, "The East," nothing more. As if that explained everything. As if Clara should already know. The treatment began in earnest at dawn. Warm broth, administered slowly to stomachs that had forgotten how to process food. Intravenous fluids for those too weak to swallow. Antibiotics rationed carefully from limited supplies. The nurses worked 12-hour shifts that stretched to 14 to 16, falling into bed too exhausted for nightmares. Sarah found herself assigned to the critical cases, the women who might not survive the week. She moved between beds with the mechanical efficiency of someone who couldn't afford to feel, checking vitals, adjusting 4 drips, recording changes in temperature and pulse. But small moments broke through the professional detachment. The way one woman flinched when Sarah reached to change her bandages, expecting violence instead of gentleness. The tears that ran silently down another's face when given water, as if kindness was more shocking than cruelty had been. By the 3rd day, patterns emerged. Some of the prisoners began to improve, their bodies responding to nutrients and rest with desperate resilience. Others remained suspended between life and death, their systems too damaged to heal, their organs shutting down despite every intervention. The pregnant woman miscarried on Thursday night, and Sarah held her hand while she sobbed words in German that needed no translation. Clara Hoffmann found herself translating more often, becoming the bridge between suffering and care. She would kneel beside beds and ask about pain levels, about symptoms, about needs that couldn't be expressed through gestures alone. And slowly, carefully, she began to ask about other things, where they were from, what they remembered, who was waiting for them, if anyone waited at all. Greta Schumann, the woman Major Carter had paused over, began to speak on the 5th day. Clara sat beside her bed during a quiet afternoon shift, updating charts, and Greta's voice emerged like something rusty, unused. She had been a teacher in Leipzig, she said. Mathematics. Her husband was a postal worker, or had been, before he was conscripted and sent east. She didn't know if he was alive. She had been arrested for listening to Allied radio broadcasts, a crime that earned her 2 years in a detention camp. But the war had stretched those 2 years into 3, and the conditions had gone from harsh to impossible as resources vanished and the Eastern Front collapsed. She didn't offer more details. Clara didn't press. But that evening, she found Major Carter in the administrative office and relayed what she'd learned. The major listened without interruption, her face unreadable, then filed the information in a folder marked Intelligence Liaison. The Army would want to know. Everyone wanted to know, it seemed, except the nurses who had to look these women in the eye and wonder what stories they were untelling. The hospital routine developed its own rhythm. Morning rounds at 0700, meals at 0800, 1200 and 1800, medications distributed like clockwork, vitals checked every 4 hours. The prisoners began to recognize their caregivers, to anticipate Sarah's gentle touch when changing dressings, to relax when Clara spoke German, to trust that the food would keep coming and the water would be clean. But trust was fragile, built on sand that shifted with every unexpected sound. One morning, an orderly dropped a metal tray in the hallway, and half the ward flinched violently, some crying out, one woman trying to hide under her bed, despite legs too weak to support her weight. Sarah moved between them, speaking softly, her hands raised, showing she meant no harm. It took an hour to calm everyone down, and afterward she sat in the supply closet and cried into her hands where no one could see. By the end of the second week, 7 of the 64 prisoners had died. Their bodies were handled with the same care as any soldiers, prepared for burial in the military cemetery outside San Antonio, wooden markers instead of stone. Major Carter insisted on it, over objections from officers who questioned why enemy prisoners deserved American graves. The Geneva Convention was not optional, she repeated, her voice like steel. These women had been prisoners of war. They would be honored as such. The surviving prisoners learned of the deaths through whispers and empty beds. Some wept, some stared in silence. Sarah watched them grieve and felt something crack deeper in her chest, a fissure that had started on that first morning and now threatened to split her open entirely. The change began with small gifts. A nurse bringing wildflowers from outside the base, arranging them in water glasses by the windows. An orderly sharing chocolate from a care package, breaking the bar into tiny pieces so everyone could have some. Clara reading German poetry aloud during evening shifts, her voice soft in the Texas twilight, words by Goethe and Heine that made grown women cry for homes they might never see again. Greta Schumann, growing stronger on a diet of broth and bread, began to sit up for short periods. She watched the nurses work with a scholar's eye, cataloging details, trying to understand. One afternoon, she called Clara over and asked, in halting English, why? Why treat them this way? Why show mercy when their countries were at war, when American boys were dying overseas, when everything should be hatred and revenge? Clara sat on the edge of the bed and was quiet for a long moment. The heat outside shimmered through the ward windows, making the air thick and dreamlike. Finally, she said, because you're human. Nothing more. Greta stared at her, and something in her face shifted, some certainty she'd been holding on to crumbling away. The breakthrough came in late July, during the worst heat of summer. The ward was stifling despite open windows and electric fans, the air too heavy to breathe. Sarah was checking on a patient named Elsa, a woman in her 40s with pneumonia that wouldn't quite break, when Elsa reached out and touched her hand. The gesture was tentative, almost fearful, as if expecting to be struck. Sarah froze, then slowly turned her palm up, letting Elsa's fingers rest there. Danke, Elsa whispered. Thank you. The words were barely audible, but they hung in the space between them like a prayer. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back. She squeezed Elsa's hand gently and nodded, unable to trust her voice. That evening, more prisoners began to speak. Small words at first. Greetings, please and thank you. Questions about the weather, about the food, about America. Clara translated, her voice growing steadier as the conversations deepened. The nurses responded with their own curiosity, asking about life in Germany before the war, about families and homes and ordinary things that had nothing to do with armies or regimes. Sarah learned that one of the women, Anna, had been a seamstress in Hamburg, that she'd made her daughter's wedding dress by hand 3 days before the bombing started. Another, Marguerite, had worked in her family's bakery, rising before dawn to knead dough, the smell of fresh bread better than any perfume. They had been ordinary women living ordinary lives until war and politics and forces beyond their control had swept them into catastrophe. The realization was like cold water. These women weren't monsters. They were mothers and wives and daughters who had made choices and mistakes, who had suffered under the same regime it was killing Allied soldiers, who had been caught in machinery too vast to resist. Sarah didn't know what to do with that knowledge. It sat uneasily beside her anger, beside the memory of Tommy's last letter talking about hedgerows and machine gun nests, beside the casualty lists that arrived weekly from Europe. Major Carter noticed the shift in atmosphere during her rounds. Conversations where there had been silence, small smiles. The prisoners sitting up more, engaging with their care instead of merely enduring it. She said nothing, just made notes in her files and continued her work. But privately, in the quiet of her office, she wondered what the army would make of all this, what it meant when the enemy became human, when hatred dissolved in the face of suffering, when mercy proved more powerful than propaganda. The progress was not linear. Some mornings, prisoners woke screaming from nightmares they couldn't or wouldn't describe. Some refused food, their bodies remembering starvation as safety, nutrition as danger. One woman, Helene, scratched at her skin until she bled, convinced that insects were crawling beneath the surface, a delusion born from months of untreated typhus. Sarah spent hours with Helene, wrapping her arms in soft bandages, speaking in low tones, trying to anchor her to reality. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes Helene would calm down, her breathing evening out, her eyes clearing. Other times, she would fight with surprising strength, and it took 3 people to keep her from hurting herself. Those were the hardest days, when Sarah questioned whether they were really helping or just prolonging agony. The war news didn't help. Paris was liberated in August, and the hospital erupted in celebration American flags, impromptu parties, letters sent home with renewed hope. But in the prisoner ward, the news fell like a stone into still water. The women became quiet, withdrawn, their faces closed off. France liberated meant Germany losing. Germany losing meant their country in ruins, their families in danger, their futures impossibly uncertain. Clara tried to navigate the tension, but found herself caught between worlds. When the nurses celebrated Allied victories, she felt her brother's death might mean something, might have purpose. But when she looked at the prisoners recovering in their beds, she saw only more suffering ahead, more villages destroyed, more families torn apart. There were no clean sides in this, no simple narratives. Just pain compounding pain, echoing across continents. One of the prisoners, a woman named Frida, who had remained silent since arrival, finally spoke in September. She pulled Clara close one morning and whispered that she had been a guard at one of the camps in the east. Not a concentration camp, she insisted, her voice desperate. Just a detention facility for political prisoners. But she had seen things, done things. She didn't elaborate, and Clara didn't ask. She just held Frida's hand and felt the weight of knowledge she didn't want, couldn't forget, had no idea what to do with. That night, Clara sat in the chapel on base, alone in the darkness, trying to pray, but the words wouldn't come. She thought about her brother, about these women, about what forgiveness meant when some crime seemed beyond its reach. The silence was absolute, offering no answers, no comfort, just the sound of her own breathing in an empty room. Sarah's letters to her mother changed as the months passed. At first, she wrote only about the weather, about other patients, about anything except the Germans in her care. But gradually, carefully, she began to tell the truth. Not the whole truth. Military censors wouldn't allow that, but fragments. She described teaching a woman named Lot how to play checkers during recovery. She mentioned the songs the prisoners sang sometimes in the evenings, German folk melodies that sounded sad and beautiful in the Texas twilight. She wrote, "They're just people, Mom. That's the hardest part. They're just people." Her mother's reply took 3 weeks to arrive. The paper was thin, the handwriting shaky. Her mother's arthritis was getting worse. But the message was clear. "You're doing good work, sweetheart. Don't let anyone tell you different. Mercy isn't weakness, even when it hurts." Sarah folded that letter and kept it in her uniform pocket, touching it sometimes when the days grew too difficult, when doubt crept in like fog, when she wondered if she was betraying Tommy by caring for his enemies. Other nurses wrote similar letters, though not all received the same response. Lieutenant Morrison got a reply from her father, a veteran of the First War, telling her she was a disgrace for wasting American resources on German prisoners when American boys were still dying. She read that letter once, then burned it in the incinerator outside the hospital, watching the paper curl and blacken until nothing remained but ash. Major Carter wrote to the Surgeon General's office, detailed reports about the prisoners' conditions, their recovery rates, their medical needs. She included observations about psychological trauma, about the long-term effects of starvation, about how these women might serve as witnesses to what was happening in German detention facilities. Her reports were filed and acknowledged, but never discussed. The Army had other priorities. The prisoners wrote letters too, though they had no way to send them. Clara found them sometimes, tucked under mattresses or hidden in pillowcases, pages covered in cramped German script. Letters to husbands and children, to parents and siblings, messages that might never reach their destinations. She read a few, with permission, translating them in the quiet privacy of the nurse's station. They were ordinary letters about ordinary longings. "I miss your laugh." They were ordinary letters about ordinary longings. "I miss your laugh. Tell Johann his mother still remembers him. Always." December arrived cold and dry, unusual weather for Texas, but welcome after months of suffocating heat. The hospital decorated for Christmas with paper chains and a small tree in the main ward, lights strung carefully, an angel on top made from gauze and wire by the Red Cross volunteers. The question arose during a staff meeting. What about the German prisoners? They celebrated Christmas too, probably. Should something be done? The room fell silent, nurses and doctors exchanging uncertain glances. Finally, Major Carter stood and said simply, "They're still human beings, still entitled to dignity." So the prisoner ward received its own decorations, modest but genuine. Sarah and Clara worked together on Christmas Eve, hanging paper snowflakes, distributing small gifts donated by local church groups, handkerchiefs, soap, writing paper. The prisoners watched in disbelief, some crying, some reaching out to touch the decorations as if they might disappear like mirages. That evening, Clara organized a small program. Some of the nurses sang carols, their voices blending in harmonies that transcended language. Then, hesitantly, the prisoners joined in. Still Nacht filled the ward, German and English mixing together. Silent nights sung by women who had every reason to hate each other, but found instead this strange, fragile peace. Sarah stood near the doorway listening, her throat tight, her eyes wet. Somewhere in France, Tommy was probably cold and miserable, huddled in a foxhole, hoping to survive another day. Here, she was singing Christmas songs with German prisoners of war. The contradiction should have torn her apart. Instead, it felt like the only honest thing she'd done all year. Greta Schumann, now weighing 93 pounds, her strength returning day by day, approached Sarah after the singing ended. She held out a small object, something carved from wood, a tiny horse, crude but recognizable, made with a pocket knife borrowed from an orderly. "For you," Greta said in careful English. "To remember," Sarah took the horse with trembling hands, feeling the weight of it, the rough texture of the wood. She wanted to say something profound, something worthy of the moment. Instead, she just whispered, "Thank you," and tucked the carving in her pocket next to her mother's letter. Spring 1945 brought news that arrived faster than anyone could process. Germany collapsing. Concentration camps liberated. Photographs emerging of horrors beyond comprehension. The prisoner ward went silent when those images appeared in newspapers. The women staring at pictures of skeletal bodies stacked like cordwood, of mass graves, of suffering that made their own detention seem almost merciful by comparison. The nurses struggled to reconcile what they were seeing with the women they'd been caring for. Were these the same people? Had these prisoners known? Been complicit? The questions hung in the air like smoke, impossible to clear, harder to breathe through. Clara confronted Greta one morning, her voice shaking, the newspaper spread between them. "Did you know?" she asked in German. "Did any of you know this was happening?" Greta stared at the photographs for a long time, her face crumpling slowly like paper being crushed. "We heard rumors," she finally said. "Whispers. Stories that seemed too terrible to believe, but we didn't know. We didn't want to know. And now that ignorance, that willful blindness, it makes us complicit, doesn't it?" She looked up at Clara with eyes full of something beyond grief. How do we live with that? Clara had no answer. She folded the newspaper and walked away, leaving Greta alone with knowledge that couldn't be unknown, guilt that couldn't be absolved. The war in Europe ended on May 8th. The hospital celebrated wildly, restrictions lifted, alcohol flowing, everyone dancing in the halls. But in the prisoner ward, the mood was darker. The women wept quietly, mourning not Germany's defeat, but the certainty that everything they'd known was gone. Their cities were rubble, their families scattered or dead. They were prisoners in a foreign land with no clear future, no way home, no home to return to, even if they could. Sarah found herself sitting with them instead of celebrating, unable to join the jubilation when these women who'd become something like friends were facing devastation. Elsa, the woman who'd first said thank you all those months ago, held Sarah's hand and said in broken English, "You saved my life. I don't know if I wanted you to, but you did." The prisoners began leaving in June, transferred to camps in the Northeast, where they would await repatriation once Germany could receive them. It would take years, everyone knew. Years of displaced persons camps, bureaucratic processing, slow rebuilding. But the hospital was needed for returning American soldiers, men coming home with wounds that needed treating, trauma that needed managing. The farewells were awkward, painful, tender. Sarah packed Greta's few belongings, including letters she'd written but never sent, photographs of family she might never see again. They stood together in the ward that had been Greta's entire world for nearly a year, neither quite knowing what to say. "You gave me back my humanity," Greta finally said. "I came here expecting to die, probably deserving to die, and you insisted I live instead. I don't know if that's mercy or cruelty, but I'm grateful either way." Sarah embraced her, breaking regulations, not caring. They held each other while other prisoners boarded the trucks that would take them north, while Clara translated goodbyes between nurses and patients who'd become something more complicated than either term could capture. By mid-July, the ward was empty, scrubbed clean, ready for new patients. The nurses returned to their regular duties, treating American servicemen, managing routine medical care, falling back into patterns that felt both familiar and strange. But something had shifted, some certainty about enemies and allies, about right and wrong, about what did to people regardless of which side they fought on. Sarah received a letter from Germany in 1947. It took months to reach her, passed through military postal services and civilian systems that were still rebuilding. The handwriting was Greta's, unmistakable even in English. She had made it home to Leipzig, now in the Soviet zone. Her husband was dead, killed near Stalingrad. But her daughter had survived, and they were living together in 2 rooms of what had once been a 5-room apartment. Food was scarce, but available. The future was uncertain, but possible. "I think of you often," Greta wrote. "I think of all the nurses who showed us kindness when hatred would have been easier, maybe even justified. You changed something in me. You made it impossible for me to hate back. I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's true." Sarah read that letter sitting on her front porch in Vermont. Home at last. Tommy beside her, having survived the war with nothing worse than a knee injury and nightmares he would not talk about. She showed him the letter, and he read it slowly, his jaw working. Finally, he handed it back and said, "That's the kind of victory nobody talks about. But maybe it's the only kind that lasts." Clara Hoffmann stayed in the Army, became a psychiatrist, spent decades studying trauma and recovery. She published a paper in 1952 about the German POWs she treated, analyzing their psychological resilience, their capacity for moral reckoning, their complicated relationship with guilt and survival. The paper was largely ignored by the academic establishment, but Clara didn't care. She'd written it for herself, for those women, for everyone trying to make sense of what mercy means in wartime. Major Elizabeth Carter retired with full honors in 1960, her service record impeccable, her reputation unblemished. But privately, in journals she kept locked in her study, she wrote about the German prisoners again and again, about the ethical complexities of healing your enemies, about whether she'd done the right thing or merely the necessary thing, about whether there was any difference between those two. She never found satisfying answers, but she never stopped asking the questions. The hospital ward where 64 German prisoners recovered and 7 died was eventually demolished during a base renovation in 1973. No marker commemorates what happened there. No plaque explains how American nurses treated enemy combatants with a grace that transcended propaganda and hatred. The only monuments are the memories of those who were there, and those memories grow fewer every year as time does its work. But for the women who survived, both the prisoners and their caregivers, something remained. A knowledge that humanity could survive even war's attempts to destroy it. That mercy was possible, even when vengeance seemed justified. That touching the hand of someone you deep been taught to hate could break something inside you that needed breaking, could build something new that was fragile but real. Sarah kept Greta's wooden horse for the rest of her life, displayed on her mantelpiece next to Tommy's service medals and photographs of their children. When asked about it, she would tell the story, not all of it, but enough. How a German prisoner of war, who weighed less than a child, had carved it as thanks for simple human kindness. How a gift from an enemy had taught her more about peace than victory ever could. And on quiet nights, when the wind moved through the Vermont pines like whispered prayers, Sarah would hold that rough wooden horse and remember the summer when she de-learned that healing was complicated, that mercy was costly, that the hardest battles weren't always fought with weapons, but with the decision to see your enemy as human and care for them anyway. That lesson, brutal and beautiful, impossible and essential, echoed across the decades like a voice calling through darkness. Not all of us who heard it understood, but those who did, those who touched the hands of suffering and chose compassion over hatred, they carried something forward that wars could never quite destroy, something small and persistent as a wooden horse carved with a borrowed knife, something that might, if tended carefully, grow into the kind of peace that's worth the cost.